I should have left when the realtor warned me.
I've never written anything like this before, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help me process what happened, or at least convince someone else to listen to the warning signs I ignored. This all started a year ago when I bought a house. It was my first home, small, a little rundown, but within my budget. I thought I was being smart by choosing something I could fix up over time instead of a polished turnkey place. The house was a two-story colonial built in the 1920s, with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. The kind of house you'd call full of character if you're trying to be polite. The realtor, Carol, was polite but hesitant when we toured it. She kept saying things like, "It's been on the market for a while, and the last owners didn't stay long." When I pressed her for more details, she just said, "Some people find old houses unsettling." That should have been my first clue. I moved in late spring, excited to start my new chapter. The first few weeks were uneventful, aside from the usual quirks of an old house, doors that didn't close properly, the occasional draft, and the unmistakable creak of floorboards settling at odd hours. I told myself it was all normal, even when I started noticing small things out of place. The first time, it was a chair in the dining room. I distinctly remember pushing it in after dinner, but the next morning it was pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there. Then there were the lights. They would flicker randomly, which I chalked up to old wiring. I called an electrician, but he couldn't find anything wrong. Then the knocking started. It was faint at first, just a light tap 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 coming from the walls at night. I assumed it was pipes or maybe mice. I set traps, checked for leaks, and even had a plumber come out, but there was nothing. The tapping got louder. By midsummer, I was struggling to sleep. The knocking would start around 2 a.m. and move through the house. First, it would come from the living room wall, then the kitchen, then upstairs, in the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was psyching myself out, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I decided to confront it. The knocking had started in the living room. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept downstairs. The house was dark and silent except for the rhythmic knock knock knock. "Hello?"
I called out, feeling ridiculous but too scared to stay quiet.
The knocking stopped. I froze, waiting for something, anything, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I'd scared it off and went back to bed. That's when I heard it again. Not the knocking this time, but a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably coming from the hallway. "Get out." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I started researching the house's history. It took some digging, but I eventually found out that a family had lived there in the 1970s. The father, a man named Henry, had been accused of killing his wife and daughter before hanging himself in the basement. The police ruled it a murder-suicide, but the details were murky, and some locals believed the house was cursed. I didn't want to believe it. I tried ignoring the strange occurrences, but things escalated quickly. I'd wake up to find my furniture rearranged. Doors would slam shut on their own. Once, I came home to find every drawer and cabinet in the kitchen open, with knives laid out in a perfect line on the counter. The final straw came on Halloween. I decided to stay home, figuring the house was creepy enough without adding trick-or-treaters into the mix. Around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard the basement door creak open. My heart sank. I hadn't opened that door in months. Slowly, I grabbed my phone and tiptoed downstairs. The basement light was on, casting a faint glow up the stairs. I stood there for what felt like hours, too afraid to go down but too terrified to turn my back on the open door. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by footsteps coming up the stairs. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, barefoot and shaking on the front lawn. My neighbor, an older woman I barely knew, came out to see what was wrong. When I told her about the footsteps, she nodded grimly. "You should have listened to Carol,"
she said.
"No one stays in that house for long." In that moment, I told myself I'd move out the next day. I don't care if people think I'm crazy or if I lost money on the sale. Whatever's in that house isn't human, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it wanted. I thought Halloween would be the worst of it, but I was wrong. Moving out wasn't as easy as I thought. I'd already sunk all my savings into the house, and finding a buyer for a property with a history like this was next to impossible. So, I decided to stick it out for a little longer, at least until I could figure out a way to cut my losses. I guess Carol was right. People did find these houses unsettling. And for good reason. I tried calling her, but her number had been disconnected. I went to her office several times and sent so many emails until they started being kicked back. Carol was clearly avoiding me. After Halloween, things got quieter for a while. The knocking stopped, the furniture stayed in place, and the house almost felt normal. I convinced myself I'd overreacted that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress of the house's history was getting to me. I decided to stay out of the basement, keep my head down, and move forward. But the peace didn't last. About a week later, I started noticing a smell. It was faint at first, like damp earth or something decaying. It seemed to come and go, but it was always strongest near the basement door. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a dead animal had gotten into the walls or the crawl space. But as the days passed, the smell got worse, so bad that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I tried to call a pest control company, but they couldn't schedule me for another 2 weeks. I couldn't wait that long. So one night, I decided to investigate the basement myself. I grabbed a flashlight, steeling myself as I opened the basement door. The smell hit me like a wall, thick and suffocating. I gagged, but forced myself to take the first step down. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. The basement was colder than I expected, even for November. My breath fogged in the air as I reached the bottom. The light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the unfinished walls. The smell was unbearable now, like rotting meat mixed with damp soil. I scanned the room with my flashlight, expecting to find a dead animal in the corner or something equally mundane. But the basement was empty. That's when I noticed the dirt. In the center of the room, the concrete floor had been cracked and pushed aside, revealing a patch of freshly disturbed earth. It looked like someone, or something, had dug it up recently. The soil was damp and dark, almost black, and the edges of the hole were sharp, like it had been done with a shovel. I don't know what possessed me to step closer, but I did. My flashlight caught something sticking out of the dirt, a piece of fabric, maybe? No. It was too stiff for fabric. It was bone. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could move, I heard it again. The low, guttural growl I'd heard on Halloween. This time, it came from the hole. The flashlight flickered as the growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating in my chest. The dirt shifted, and something began to rise from the hole. It was black and shapeless at first, like smoke or a shadow, but as it moved, it began to take form. A human form. I froze. My legs refused to work, my brain screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. The figure turned its head toward me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze burning into me.
Why are you still here?
It rasped, the voice barely more than a whisper. I finally found my legs and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, shaking and gasping for air. I stayed in a motel that night, too afraid to go back. The next morning, I called the police and told them about the hole in the basement. I didn't mention the figure or the voice. I knew how crazy that would sound, but I hoped they'd find the bones and take it from there. When the police arrived, I waited outside, pacing nervously as they went into the house. It wasn't long before one of the officers came back out, looking confused. "There's nothing in the basement," he said. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "There was a hole in the floor, Bones." He shook his head. "The basement floor is intact. No holes, no dirt, nothing unusual." I didn't know what to say. I followed him back inside, and sure enough, the basement was exactly as it had been when I first moved in. Solid concrete, no cracks, no dirt. The smell was gone too. I left that house for good that day. I don't know what I experienced there, and part of me never wants to know. I ended up selling it at a massive loss to a developer who planned to tear it down, and honestly, I hope they did. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the basement. I dream about the hole, the growl, and the shadowy figure that told me to leave. And sometimes, I wake up to that familiar tap. Tap! Tap! Tap!
And I swear I can still smell the dirt.